Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council. Thank you so much for joining us on our session today. We're going to give folks just another minute or two for some late arrivals, and we'll get started shortly. All right, why don't we get started? Again, my name is Jason Hremza. I'm a planner with Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council. Thank you again so much for joining us for today's session on land use and equity, and looking at some of the origins of these issues, both locally and nationally. We have with us today Shane Wigand. He's a tremendous researcher and presenter on this topic, and I will turn it over to him very shortly. I just want to run through a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We will be asking everybody to please stay on mute while the presentation is occurring. I will be here the whole time to monitor the chat room, and then at the end we should have plenty of time for questions and discussions at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to use the chat room function during the presentation. And then at the end, I can moderate anyone who would like to ask their questions verbally. The session is being recorded, so it will be available within probably no more than a week up on our YouTube channel, along with all the other sessions at the Fall Local Government Workshop. So for anybody that was unable to attend, they'll be able to view the recording. And for anybody that is here for credit, any town or village or city land use board members, planning board, zoning board members that are here for their training credit, please make sure your full name is visible on the participant list so that we can record who's in attendance and document your attendance here for your municipality. Otherwise, if you have any logistical questions, feel free to ask me either by email or in the chat room or whoops, hang on here. All right. Or in the chat room. And in the event, hopefully in the unusual event of any technical difficulties, my colleague Emily Royce is here, and Shane will be able to continue with the presentation, and I will rejoin you all shortly. So with that, I will turn it over to Shane. And again, a big thank you from Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council to Shane for being able to spend some time with us today.
Hello, everybody. I'm Shane Wiegand. I teach 4th grade in Rush Henrietta. This year I'm on sabbatical, co-leading the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project, which is generously hosted by the Pat Stone Foundation. Our goal at our project is to make sure that every student and person in our community has a deeper understanding of Rochester's local history of racist policy and the people of color and allies who came together and always come together and still come together to work for justice and equity and resist those kinds of policies. particularly as it relates to land use and housing. Today, I want to help tell some of those stories. We'll talk a little bit about redlining, racial covenants, and other forms of exclusion, especially exclusionary zoning. We'll take a real focus on that, as that exists in most of our towns and continues to be one of the biggest factors in why our community is at the top when it comes to racial segregation. What I'm going to show you today, though, is a version of our curriculum that is in lecture format. Normally, when we work with students, this is our amazing team of teachers. We go through inquiry. Students look at the primary sources and are given tools to examine those primary sources. Today, though, I'm just going to walk you through a series of primary sources that help tell, hopefully, a rich story about our community, about its pursuit of justice, and how we can be inspired by those who have come before to continue to make progress and work towards justice, especially as it relates to land use. I'm really excited to share this, and throughout, feel free to throw questions in the chat, but at the end, we'll open it up for some question and answer, some discussion. I really love to get to know each of you and hear more about why you're here and what you've taken from this and how it might apply in your field and how that could be used. So excited for that, but I'm going to talk pretty quickly, share a bunch of history, and hopefully we'll have a really great conversation. So here we go. Oh, I should also tell you this. I serve on the boards of City Roots Community Land Trust as their outreach coordinator, where we do a lot of work around housing justice. I'll talk a little about that at the end. And I also serve on the board of Connected Communities and Police Accountability Board Alliance. So let's start with some definitions. New York State educators are supposed to follow this definition for structural racism, and I really like it. It comes from our New York State culture responsive framework, saying that structural racism is the operation of racial bias across institution and society. It describes the cumulative and compounding effects of an array of factors that systematically privilege one group over another, versus equity, which is the state equality ideal of being just, impartial, and fair. Equity is synonymous with fairness and justice, and to be achieved and sustained, it has to be thought of structural and as systematic concept, not just as an ideal. Equity is a robust system, a dynamic process that reinforces, replicates equitable ideas, power, resource, strategies, conditions, habits, and outcomes. In a really helpful way that I think about some of these terms, especially these identifiers or adjectives of anti-racist, passively racist, and racist, comes from Dr. Beverly Tatum. And these can be used to describe an action of an individual, a policy, a land use policy. And I think our really helpful visual is that this idea of thinking of racism and the system of racism as that moving walkway at an airport. Racist action or policy is going fast on that moving walkway. It's on board with the destination. The goal is creating inequity and benefiting one group over another. The passively racist person in the middle is on that moving walkway. That's me for most of my life, kind of just standing still, but being moved along by the walkway, trying to treat everyone nicely, but the outcome still is racial inequality. No action towards equity is being taken, and you're carried in that same direction of inequity. Whereas the anti-racist takes action, moves in the opposite direction, and works towards justice. And hopefully this visual will be something really helpful as we go through these primary sources to help you kind of think about the actions, the policies, and kind of offer some helpful language. Not thinking of racist or racism as like a cudgel to say something is just horrible and bad, but to describe an action, a moment in time, and something that we can look at, take apart, dismantle, and move towards that place of equity. Because the fact is that in our community, we have significant issues when it comes to land, to housing, and to racial inequity. In New York State, our schools across the state are the most segregated school districts in the entire country. Right here in Rochester, we are #1. The border between Penfield and Rochester is the most segregated school district border in all 50 states. The town of Brighton is the 6th most segregated school district border in all 50 states, and West Irondequoit is #7. When you look at our population map, and the most recent 2020 map looks almost identical, you'll notice that our suburbs are predominantly white and our inner city predominantly Black. For my planners and land use folks in this space, and just noticing the ways highways and even industry separates these Black neighborhoods, even rivers, from these suburban areas or white spaces that are part of this city. Notice how that in these same neighborhoods that were redlined, or those predominantly Black and Latino neighborhoods, they have the highest rates of all health equity indicators. Notice food insecurity, asthma, lack of insurance, mental health, high blood pressure. Wade Norwood of Common Ground Health is on our advisory board at our curriculum project. It's been really helpful in helping us tell some of this story that when you really look at is quite startling. And I also really encourage you to check out their newest report at Common Ground Health called The Color of Health that goes deep into health equity. When it comes to wealth, there's a significant gap between white and Black. In our country, the gap between the typical wealth of a white family is about 10 times that of the wealth of a typical Black family, something that continues to grow and widen. And despite policies like the Fair Housing Act of 1968, homeownership rates by race, the gap has not come close to closing and in fact continues to expand. And when you look at the data for our 9-county region that comes out of ACT Rochester, you'll notice similar gaps when it comes to home ownership rates amongst Black and Latino folks compared to white, and same for what the value of those folks that do own a home, how much the value of those homes are worth. So how do we get to this place of incredible inequality and injustice? Well, part of it has to do with, as a community, I think we've often failed to have the courage to tell the truth about our history, to face it head on, and to own our mistakes, to own the places where we maybe intentionally did these things and figure out how we move forward. But to do this, we've got to live out these words of James Baldwin. It's the kind of the central message of my talk today. He says, not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And I want to invite you to join me today in taking that step in the opposite direction on that moving walkway towards anti-racism, and having the courage to face some of the uncomfortable facts about our community and the ways that we got to where we are, that we might work towards justice and equity. Because the fact is, people of color have always lived these words of James Baldwin here in this community. They have always done it, and they have always challenged it. From Austin Stewart, who was enslaved in Sodus, New York, and escaped to Rochester and fought for abolition, to people like Frederick Douglass, to people like Howard Coles, who in the 1930s, when redlining began at the federal level, called it out in his Black newspaper, the Frederick Douglass Voice, called out city leaders for enforcing this, and real estate agents and bankers and planners for what they were doing with urban renewal. He was largely ignored by the all-white establishment at the time, but he continued to speak out and call it what it was. Or his friend, Dr. Anthony Jordan, Rochester's second Black doctor, who worked with Coles to take a look at the way housing and land use was directly connected to health, finding that in the 40s, the Black death rate from all causes was 50% higher than that of the white death rate. When it came to tuberculosis death rates, it was 2.5 times that. Those are similar numbers to Black and white death rates from COVID-19 in Monroe County. And it's hard to see how much things have changed. He even published this in the Democrat and Chronicle, and folks chose not to listen. Or Dr. Lunsford, who successfully fought University of Rochester for its segregated nurseries, for not allowing Black students into its medical and nursing programs, who hosted Martin Luther King in his house, always speaking out against racial segregation in our community. Or the Reverend Body, who almost 10 years after Howard Coles started talking about redlining, continued to carry that mantle forward, talking about the segregation and the experience that he was facing as a pastor in the 3rd Ward, saying the housing situation has always been an enigma to people of color, saying in Rochester, only 2 areas have been gracefully made available. If any attempt is made to move out of these Black ghettos, the attempt is met with opposition. And one of the biggest forms of opposition, in fact, that codified the opposition to keeping people of color out of certain spaces and places in our community, was the New Deal, particularly the National Housing Act of 1934. This is where redlining comes from. Now, this law was sponsored by Senator Wagner, not of Mississippi or Florida, but of New York State, and signed into law by Franklin Roosevelt, again, not a Southerner, someone from New York State, former governor of New York State, and they signed this into law. This created our suburbs. This ended up resulting with thousands and millions of homes being built across our country and helping towns like Pittsburgh and Webster and Greece explode in size and home ownership. It creates the 30-year FHA mortgage. It does all these amazing things, but it did it only for white folks, at least really until the late 1960s, written explicitly into the policy. It said this: if a neighborhood's to retain stability, it's necessary properties continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. A change in social or racial occupancy generally leads to instability and a reduction in value. Going on to say, to be most effective, if you're going to receive any kind of federally backed insurance or mortgages, especially as developers, to buy up a housing tract in a suburb, to get that, you have to make sure that you have put deed restrictions on all land, explicitly prohibiting the occupancy of properties except by the race for which they're intended. It even goes on so far as to say that highways or high-speed traffic arteries or parkways can be constructed to separate inharmonious racial groups and give a neighborhood a better or more effective rating, something that directly ties into Rochester's inner loop and is very connected. It even talks about in this underwriting manual how if a neighborhood is a white neighborhood, but that the students go to a school that has Black students at it, that neighborhood should get a red-lined rating instead of a green-lined rating. So what are these ratings I'm talking about? So a big part of the enforcement, just a small part. It's not the main part, but it gets a lot of attention. It's important to understand are these maps, these redlining or residential security maps that came out of the 1934 National Housing Act. Here's Rochester's. At this point, I think a lot of folks are familiar, maybe have seen this image. Let's unpack what this image really shows. It takes that language of race and class and starts to kind of map out where that is in our community and which areas are safe and secure for federally backed mortgages. So green and blue areas were best or desirable because they were 100% white, Protestant, and upper middle class. Yellow meant declining, maybe folks who were white but were immigrants, poorer folks, older homes, and red meant hazardous because of the presence of Black, Italian, or Jewish individuals, or hazardous potential industry like over here in Plex, where the vacuum oil site was, or Fashion Park, or the Goodman Plaza Quarry area that were kind of toxic places that could also lead to a hazardous rating. And if it got a hazardous rating, that meant that was where people of color were going to be steered and forced into living, and then no federal or local investment was going to go into those different areas or neighborhoods. And you can see an actual assessor's report. You can even go online to mapping inequality to the University of Richmond and look at every city's map, click on every neighborhood and read the descriptions. And the way these maps were made, it's weighted with class and race is the most important part. And notice here, Cornhill, or the Clarissa Street area, was given a red rating because it was 75% Black, 10% foreign, and the class of folks was workers and laborers. Notice the honorific of men is not included, whereas if you look at the town of Irondequoit, notice white collar business professional men, 0% Black, 0% foreign. Compare that to the 7th Ward, that Hudson, Clinton, Joseph area of the city, 10% Black. Today, that's like 95% Black. Notice 40% foreign, including Italian and Jewish folks, which think of the 1930s. Eugenics was huge at the time. Remember George Eastman here in Rochester, Kodak. Eastman was one of the biggest funders of the American Eugenics Society that was helping promote the differences in the races and how people who are Eastern European, Jewish, Italian, and Black were less than those white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. This was popular. This was Princeton, Yale, this was Harvard. Hitler's coming here to get ideas from American thinkers and policymakers, copying policies like this to bring back to Germany, bringing on the Holocaust. Compare this to Beechwood, where I currently live. The neighborhood at the time was 2% Black, but hazardous. And today it's over 75% Black. Compared to Kodak's Meadowbrook neighborhood, built by Eastman, financed by ESL Bank, which was founded to finance these whites-only mortgages. It was 0% Black at the time. 20 years after, it was built by Kodak. And notice businessmen, executives, the Kodak crowd. 19th Ward, all these different areas. Meanwhile, all of the suburbs, they weren't rated on this map because so few people actually lived there at the time. They were little villages. But the government and future rulings made it so that these suburban areas essentially were green-lined. And this policy was so effective that by 1960, Rochester's most integrated suburb with just 11 individual people of color was the town of Henrietta. And the reason Henrietta was integrated is because Dr. Walter Cooper and some friends at the NAACP organized and decided to move in. In '58, Dr. Cooper and Helen Cooper became the first Black family to own a home in the town of Henrietta. They didn't want to live in Henrietta, but Dr. Cooper, who's a good friend and member of my advisory board, said that Henrietta was the only place where they could find a place to live because the white folks were the least organized in Henrietta, which was a very small farming community at the time. Richard Rothstein is a good friend of the project and whom we've been helping with his upcoming book, describes a little more national scale, saying that these government loans insured half of all new mortgages nationwide, that almost the rest of private mortgages followed these same racist rules and how these mortgages were doled out, giving out over $119 billion in mortgage insurance during this period of time. And it also tied into things like public housing and where public housing could be. It's fascinating to see here our FHA underwriter, Alfred Gerdes, smoking his pipe and driving a giant bulldozer backhoe, I don't know what that thing is, from 1947, but he's in Brighton building public housing for veterans. It was explicitly whites only public housing. Same with Norton Village over in the Empire area of Rochester. And what's fascinating about this is Howard Coles of The Voice, who you saw earlier, he tried to get Black veterans of World War II to be able to live in these homes. They met every requirement, number of kids, being married, all the different things you needed. They fought for their country. And Gerdes, Elmer Milliman, and the other folks in charge of this, Elmer Milliman was one of the big bankers, John Dale, one of the big city planners, denied their applications because of their skin color every single time. Let's dial back a little even more here for scale. Over 35 million families, according to Rothstein, benefited from these FHA and VA-backed loans. 98% of them were white. When I think about my own family, both my grandfathers received FHA loans in the 1950s and early 60s that allowed them to buy homes at a time when Black folks making the same income could not have chosen to live where my grandparents lived or benefited from the incredible generational wealth. When I think about my grandfather, who in 1955 bought a home in Greece, his home quadrupled in value. He used the equity from that home to send my mom to college. My grandpa helped pay for my college. He helped pay for my car when I graduated from college. When I got in a car accident right out of college as a young teacher with no money in the bank, I got a check in the mail the next day to help pay off that $3,000 debt to the car place, right? That benefit of generational wealth that in our country is directly tied to housing, that is directly tied to white supremacy, I think is so important for us to understand. Meanwhile, the real estate industry was actively participating in this process. And in fact, the reason redlining happened at all was because the National Association of Real Estate Boards, the Builders Associations, the Mortgage Assessor Associations were lobbying their local congressmen and federal officials to put some larger housing policy in place. But starting in the 1920s, the Real Estate Board adopted this code that lasted to the late 1950s, explicitly saying that a real estate agent would lose their real estate license if they brought a Black person into a white neighborhood. And this was enforced. Howard Coles got his real estate license, started showing homes to to Black folks in white neighborhoods. And then like Frank Drum, who was Rochester's real estate board president at the time, forced Howard Coles out of the real estate industry for breaking this code of ethics. And they ruled over our community, enforcing the redlining in a very, very concerted and coordinated way. But some people broke through. So here's Dr. Alice Holloway Young, also a good friend and friend of the project, who has shared quite a bit about her story recently. School number 3 was named for her. She was actually the first Black principal in Monroe County in 1962. She helped found Monroe Community College, just an amazing person. In 1957, here she is, PhD, upper middle class, should be able to live wherever she wants, just like my grandfather, who's the same age. But she can't live wherever she wants. She goes to every real estate agent and bank in town. No one will show her a house or pre-approve her for a mortgage because of her skin color. So she was involved with the NAACP. Her friend Harper Sibley, the Western Union Telegraph merchant, is also involved and decides to buy her a house and sell it to her with a private mortgage under the table as a way to subvert redlining and this real estate board code of ethics. The Youngs move in the middle of the night, and the next morning, they find this note in their mailbox from the Ku Klux Klan. Matt Santi, I think you're annotating the screen, so just be careful there. She finds this note threatening them and goes on to say in the note that they're going to burn their house down. The Klan does try to burn their house down. They fight back, they succeed. Alice actually says that what helped them stay there for the next 17 years is they found some allies. In the street, one family, the Bush family, was a white family that stood with the Youngs in helping them face the racial terror and abuse, helping them live there for the next 17 years. And what Dr. Young often asks me to share when I share her story is to remember that this is the late 1950s. Oftentimes people say, oh, it was just the times, or white people didn't know better. But Alice Young wants you to remember the Bush family, who did know what was right, and join them in fighting back against these racist policies, or the Harper Sibley's. We don't think of our community, though, as a Klan town, but take a look at this photograph in the Democrat and Chronicle in the late 1920s with over 20,000 Klansmen burning 3 50-foot high crosses in East Rochester and what is today East Rochester's high school football field. This is quite staggering. The DNC reports cross burnings from the Klan in Black people's front yards, like the Youngs, all the way until the early 1980s, especially in the towns of Penfield, Gates, and Henrietta. So it was something that was a part of enforcing, in a more civil disobedience way, racial segregation in our community. Something that was begun before it was codified by the Federal Housing Act is something called racially restrictive covenants. My students and I started learning about these, hearing some stories, and we started going to the county clerk's office and researching them. We ended up partnering with City Roots Land Trust and Yale Environmental Protection Clinic at the law school, and published a massive report last summer documenting tens of thousands of racial covenants across Monroe County and the people who created them and enforced them. And the story that we found was quite significant. On thousands of homes in the deed, legally enforceable, with statements that said no Black person or person who is not of the Caucasian race can live in these homes. And it wasn't something that a small group of hardcore racists or fringe folks did. This was something endorsed by the local papers, county leaders, business leaders. This was known about and enforced. In fact, the Monroe County legislator and supervisor, every single one voted in the affirmative to put this racial covenant, barring no person of any race other than the Caucasian race, on county tax foreclosed properties. This is Clarence Smith right here, longest serving county manager, I think ever in the country. There's his signature right on this language. These were advertised in the Democrat and Chronicle. But even before this was codified by the federal government, Kodak was doing this. So like in Brighton, the Meadowbrook neighborhood in the early 20s, Vice President of Kodak, Harry Haight, was putting this specific covenant barring Black folks from ever being able to own or live in those homes. Today, Meadowbrook is still 4% Black and majority white. They have actually added an anti-racist restriction clause to their covenant, which I think is a really powerful statement of the neighbors owning the legacy of racism in their neighborhood. And it's our hope that neighborhoods across Monroe County will start to do this on their lands and publicize their owning, that this is part of their community. It's connected to why their communities are still 95% white and a part of this process of working towards change. But it wasn't just Kodak, it wasn't just Monroe County government, it was the bishop of the Catholic Church putting these under Catholic churches in Rochester. It was school boards like here in Gates. In 1941, the school board signed on to making sure it was a whites-only school at Thomas Edison School number 4, specifically saying it could never be occupied or used by any members of a race that was not Caucasian. The DNC advertising hundreds of covenants right here in Pittsburgh as a real feature of why you might move into East Avenue Estates there on East Ave. We're in Irondequoit. Over 2,000 homes with highly restricted building lots barring people of color, one of which was agreed to by founder of Wegmans, Walter E. Wegman, who agreed to this. And when the covenant expired, re-upped it to ensure the whiteness of that space when he moved. You'll see these all throughout Penfield, all throughout Greece. Notice Italians and Jewish people are often added to these covenants. The head of the local builders association and real estate board was putting these on the homes that they were building in Gates. Even the president of Rochester's Bar Association was putting racial covenants on homes. I know I'm going a little overkill here, But that's intentional. I want you to really see the scope of just how many of our homes still have this on the deed. Anyone can go to the clerk's office and check their deed. If it was built between the 20s and early 50s, there's a good chance you have a covenant on your home, and there's something that can be done to address it. But back in the 50s, people of color knew what was going on. They were addressing it and they were fighting back. Like Judge Reuben Davis, Rochester's second Black lawyer and first Black judge. He tried to move into the 19th ward. And in his oral history, he says this: the wife and I were looking for a house. It was 1958. We saw one we liked in 135 Elmdorf Ave in Rochester. Remember, that was a blue line neighborhood, 19th ward of the city, whites only. He says, I would say there were probably 4 Black families that lived anywhere west of Genesee at the time, and the owner refused to sell to us because we were Black. There was a restrictive covenant in the deed that when these houses were built, were not to be sold to people of color or to Italians. And that would have included Jewish folks as well. But in 1944, just a quick side note here, or explanatory comma, Italians, Jewish, Eastern European people were legally discriminated against by the FHA. But by 1944, the GI Bill was passed, legally making those folks white and worthy of a GI or FHA loan. Reuben Davis fought for his country in World War II, and he returned to this kind of discrimination, nor could he receive any federally backed loans. So he went to go get this house. You'll notice the real estate agent was Nothnagel that was enforcing this racial covenant. You can see the advertisement for his home right there, FHA appraised. He writes, I was active in the NAACP, so a white friend bought the house and transferred it to me. We had to go through those kinds of devious methods in order to find housing. And he goes on to talk about how even if you had means like he did, it was still incredibly difficult to find your way out of those red line neighborhoods. This is a map that Yale Law School created for us to help paint a little bit more of a picture of where these covenants are. We overlaid it with a redlining map. Each of the Black spaces on the map were whites only neighborhoods. We estimate there's another 10 to 20,000 covenants yet to uncover on the microfilm. And we're hoping that the county clerk will digitize those deeds so that we can more easily find those, label them, and call out the neighborhoods that have yet to own that this is part of their neighborhood and community's story. Another thing that was just as effective at keeping people of color out of these white enclaves is something called a blackface minstrel show. It also shows the widespread support for these racist policies, as well as the fact that this was not hidden. I think so often we think of, oh, this was the time, people just didn't know. I think they did. And something that really shows us is what was being explicitly taught through racist curriculum in every school district in Monroe County, every town hall, every Kiwanis and Rotary Club, something called a blackface minstrel show. Here you see on the front page of the Holloway Falls Times in 1960 at Holloway Falls Elementary School, a group of students in blackface. Notice their faces are painted with burnt cork, painted on garish red lips. The main characters at every blackface show were always called N-men. You had a Black Sambo character, a Jim Crow character, a Jim C-O-O-N character, singing messages of hate, celebrating white supremacy, and sending a very clear message of who was welcome in these neighborhoods, in these spaces, in these schools, and making it very clear who is not welcome. President of the NAACP at the time, Quentin Primo, in 1962 starts attacking these because his children, they were one of the first Black families to move into Irondequoit, were being faced with these kinds of things at school. But as usual, places like Kodak, they led the way. In the 20s and 30s, Kodak proudly published in their magazine photos of executives and their children in blackface. GM did the same. You'll see this all throughout RCSD, the Democrat and Chronicle proudly publishing puff pieces, not advertisements, puff pieces about these blackface shows. Where I went to school in Webster and the Rotary would collaborate on their annual blackface show, you'll see this at Aquinas. Pittsburgh Town Hall would partner with the Catholic Church to put on their annual blackface show through the 50s. Brighton had its annual Licorice Lights performance. Allendale and U of R would partner to put on their student-led blackface minstrel show. You'll see this at RIT every year, U of R. Almost every single town had one every year in their schools and community institutions, sending a clear message of who is welcome. But people like Quentin Primo, Flora Harris, they spoke out. a 10-year campaign to try to end these shows in Rochester, finally succeeding with the death of Martin Luther King, describing that these shows must be banned in letters to the editor and letters to schools, saying they must be banned from all public and private schools, churches, and public buildings. To do otherwise will cripple permanently the attitudes of all white youth involved in these keyword community accepted shows towards all the dark-skinned people of the world. Meanwhile, activists are continuing to fight against housing discrimination. Instead of action, they got what often happens, what just happened in Monroe County, another report that offers the opportunity to make some change, but often just gives us a little more detail about what's going on. And this report, while not super helpful then, is very helpful now in understanding the local effects of these racist policies. For example, this document found in 1950s, 80% of all Black folks lived in just two neighborhoods, the redlined 3rd and 7th wards. More than 1,600 units in both wards had either no bathroom or a shared bathroom, and in more than 2,000 units, there was more than one person living per room. This incredible overcrowding because of redlining led to huge problems in the community. Constance Mitchell ran for office and became the first Black elected official in our community because of redlining. She writes, "We were living in a community bursting at the seams because there wasn't open housing. When John and I bought our house on Gregg Street, the real estate agent told us, I can't show you houses west of Jefferson Avenue. They're just not open to Black people. So we were confined from Jefferson Avenue back to the river to look for a place to live on the west side of the city." I think we all know about Jefferson Avenue last spring with the death of Daniel Prude in police custody. That was on Jefferson Avenue. You know, thinking about the connection between redlining and the current unrest and racial uprising that's been happening in our community, it goes right back to what was happening in Connie Mitchell's community of the 1950s and 60s, where this report documents that 30% of all units had no running water, that garbage pickup in these neighborhoods was significantly poorer than in the white neighborhoods of the city, as well as the suburbs. Going on to say that not a single FHA or VA loan was given to any Black person in any Monroe County suburb, at least until 1958. It documents instance after instance of move-in violence and white resistance to Black folks coming into white enclaves. For example, the Bias family, who in 1964, he was a dentist. They bought a home in West Irondequoit, but quickly moved after having rocks and bricks thrown through their living room windows at night, terrifying them, really terrorism to keep them out of their neighborhoods, forcing them to sell and move to Henrietta to be in solidarity with the Coopers, but not before having to sue and successfully sue for the right to live in their home on Gatehouse Trail, because the developer wouldn't sell them the home because of their skin color. Or Dr. Lunsford, who you can see here hosting Dr. Martin Luther King at his house in 1958 and 62, who came to town in part to deal with police brutality in redline neighborhoods, as well as the housing discrimination. Or the Tullivers, who in 1960 dealt with some really difficult neighbors as they moved into Verena Drive in Brighton. The Tullivers had bought the house, everything but the paperwork was signed, and the white neighbors organized, put the money together, and illegally bought the house out from under the Tullivers at the bank. The Tullivers were part of the NAACP, and they sued. The county executive got involved. I think one of the Jewish congregations in Brighton stood with the Tullivers and helped them get that house and move in next door to those neighbors that had fought so hard to keep them out. Or the Stubbses in Greece, Ellen Stubbs having a white friend from her same income level, same position kind of job, go and tour a development on Long Pond Road in Greece the same time that she went. The white friend was told there were multiple homes that could be sold to her. The Stubbses were told that there were no longer any homes available. They sued, they won, and helped integrate the town of Greece in 1963. Meanwhile, you have this massive disinvestment, 30% of homes without running water, incredible overcrowding, all kinds of friction. This is happening in cities all across the country in these neighborhoods that were designed by redlining, local officials and the federal government to be this way, but they were falling apart and it was causing a problem in other areas. So the government comes up with a fancy word called urban renewal. Rochester is given millions of dollars to build highways that they can use to get rid of what one of the head of the Highway Association described at the time as getting rid of our N-word towns is what Highway is going to do. We all know about people like Robert Moses, who did a lot of this in New York City and consulted right here in Rochester to help us with our inner loop and thinking through these policies. And it led to some significant displacement. So in the 7th ward, the Baden-Orman project, over 886 families were forced out of their homes. And where could they go? Another red line neighborhood. So they move over to the Clarissa Street, Jefferson Avenue. A librarian, Olga Edwards, a woman of color who lived on Jefferson Avenue, remembers in the late 50s watching thousands of Black folks move into Jefferson Avenue, where white folks would be leaving their homes and separating them into like 5 apartments. And they'd have 5 families sharing 1 bathroom and a kitchen. And up and down Jefferson Avenue, just massive overcrowding was happening. And then in the 3rd ward, we're going into the 60s, over 850 families were displaced from their homes for urban renewal. And this was led by Elmer Millman of Central Trust Bank and John Dale, a planner with the city, who on this public committee refused to allow Black participation. Howard Coles tried to get on board, but was denied, again, because of the color of his skin, and it left devastation in these communities. And it also led to significant unrest when it came to policing. So this is, you think about the overcrowding, right? There's going to be big problems that come with it. And so the city has a choice. The county has a choice. Do we choose to fund equity? Do we fund equitable integrated housing across the county? Or do we fund our police department and enact a policy of containment in these neighborhoods? And the police force was funded and increased in size, and patrols in these red line neighborhoods dramatically went up. And lots of big high profile instances happened. Like here you can see Rufus Fairwell. He's sitting in a wheelchair because he was locking up the gas station that he owned in the red line Clarissa Street area, Plymouth Exchange area. Arrested, brought downtown, and while handcuffed, brutally beaten within an inch of his life. You can see him and the Reverend Gibson from Memorial AME Church on the steps of City Hall leading a protest that looks almost identical to some of the Daniel Pruitt protests last fall, demanding justice for Rufus Fairwell and what he faced. Even Malcolm X came to town during this period because of the instances of police brutality that were happening in these neighborhoods. But action wasn't taken soon enough. By 1964, thousands protested in the street, targeting specifically white-owned businesses and landlords that had been enacting and enforcing a lot of these policies. Laura Warren Hill, in her amazing new book, Strike the Hammer, documents this story and the coordinated protest or uprising that has often been called a riot. It was directly caused, though, by displacement, the lack of running water, and the police brutality instances, and ultimately the redlining that was going on in this period of time. Meanwhile, the same problems are happening in schools. People like Dr. Cooper and his friends at the NAACP Education Committee ended up suing the city school district. And this map was created showing where people went to school based on where they lived with their neighborhood schools. This shows non-white populations. Notice in the red line neighborhoods, like school 9 and 14, 80 to 90% of students are Black. School 3 and 4, over 90 to 95% of students are Black. Whereas you come into these green line and blue line neighborhoods, it's 0.9, 0%, 0.01% of students are students of color. Fascinating to kind of think about those connections. But they sued, they won, and it took 10 years for Brown versus Board to be enforced in Rochester. Never was enforced in Monroe County. Let's take a look at this. So we all know like images on the left, right? Elizabeth Eckford, 1957, Ruby Bridges, just dealing with horrific white parent protest against them coming to school, just terrorized for going to school. But look at the right, 1971, Rochester, New York, the DNC reporting tensions developed at Charlotte High School after 3 Black girls were hit by flying glass on a bus that was stoned. In the middle is Mary Nicolisi, who was one of the leaders of the Ku Klux Klan that even put on robes and went outside the Jewish school board member Goldberg's house to protest the integration plan in their Klan robes. Here she is leading a mob of angry parents, throwing bricks, rocks, racial epithets at students of color who are on the other side of the lens, just trying to go to school and have a fair, equal, and integrated education. Or this image from the Times Union from 1971, a march of over 1,000 parents marching down the streets of Rochester demanding segregated schools. Or over here, notice how always with every instance I've shown you today, I've showed a racist policy and I've shown the people of color who have fought back. James Beard was one of the organizers of the Black Student Union at Charlotte High School. And here's their yearbook photo in 1971. These youth organized together. They would walk in groups of 3 down the hallways for safety, oftentimes walking into school with black puppets being hung from trees, students and parents hiding behind the cemetery walls over at Holy Sepulchre to hurl projectiles at their buses as they came into town. And yet these students persisted. They kept going to school. They saw the value in what was happening. But ultimately, RCSD school board caved. And by the next year, the integration program had been disbanded. Milliken versus Bradley in the 70s made it so that you couldn't integrate across town borders anymore. And it's led to our area having the most segregated school district line in the country, with Penfield in the city of Rochester. Brighton number 6, remember West White number 7 in the country. And tied to all of this is also zoning. And these policies are pretty much the same zoning policies in all of our suburban towns today. But these zoning codes were not always there. Zoning was pretty small. It was mainly around industry, not being by homes. But in the 1960s, especially as New York State started to change some of its fair housing law before the federal government did, local zoning boards like Brighton's, Penfield's, and Pittsford's realized that they had an opportunity to continue to discriminate against people of color and keep them out of their neighborhoods, not through specific race-based exclusion anymore, but class-based. And even with the 1968 Fair Housing Act, it's still legal to discriminate based on class. So these all-white zoning boards like Penfield's here in 1965, they responded to hundreds of letters, speakers, doctors, lawyers, especially like the Scribner Road area of Penfield was like a big spot where a lot of letters came in saying, we want exclusionary zoning based on class to price out Black people from moving into our neighborhoods, using those exact words. In fact, in the early 1980s, the town of Penfield commissioned a report about their zoning that actually admits that race was a part of the reason for their current zoning that exists as their current zoning to this day. But as always, people of color spoke up, like Robert Rhodes, who was the head of our NAACP in 1968. He was one of the first Black people to live in the town of Pittsford. And he wrote a letter to the editor calling out the racism that was happening, citing the Kerner report about the divided community that was ahead, saying that if Pittsford adopted its new AAA zoning policy to increase land size and how the value of property that had to be there to make it almost impossible for any time of apartments or affordable housing to be built, he said we were going to be on our way to a divided community on its way to destruction. He even described Pittsford zoning as the new racial covenants. Robert Rhodes even organized several hundred white pastors to protest at the zoning board meeting against the housing measures. But the residents of Pittsford made it very clear, just like Penfield and Webster and Brighton, what they wanted in their community, R1 zoning that would exclude based on class. And that's led us to this, a community that is largely divided, suburb and city, based on class and on race, that is having unimaginable tolls on people based on where they live, from all kinds of health indicators. I mean, in fact, thinking about Pittsford, a green-lined area, a child from Pittsford's 14534 zip code born today, according to Commonwealth Health, they're going to live 9 years longer than a child from Rochester's red-lined 3rd Ward or 14608 zip code. The effects of this structural racism are literally leading to 9 years of life difference, white and Black, in our community. In fact, a big national report that recently came out from the National Community Investment Coalition compared all of our green and blue line neighborhoods with red just in the city and found that current residents of city neighborhoods that were historically redlined have a life expectancy of 5 years shorter than those in neighborhoods coded green. And you can actually go online and compare. You can click on every neighborhood and compare neighborhoods and see the gaps with asthma, with life expectancy, with years per life lost, all these different indicators. It's really staggering. And again, the home ownership rates, but notice home value. So after 68 Fair Housing Act is passed, people of color can live where they want, but they're mostly priced out of the suburbs because of zoning. And by then, those homes that were subsidized by the government have exploded in value, like my grandfather's did. You can't afford them if you're a first-time home buyer, or don't have equity from being able to own a house before. So folks buy houses in the city that are significantly devalued because of this kind of disinvestment, which leads to huge gaps in how much people's homes are worth today based on race for those people that do own homes. So to close, I want to talk about this quote from James Baldwin again that I started with. Baldwin writes, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." And I hope you've joined me today and maybe having a little bit of courage to walk in the opposite direction on that moving walkway of systemic racism towards facing this history, towards owning it, to being able to maybe say for yourself, like I just did, you know, I've benefited from this if you're a white person in this space. If your parents or grandparents owned a home before 1968, you've benefited from structural racism. It's helped add wealth to your family. And I think that's important for us to own. If our towns are continuing to have these kinds of zoning codes that are excluding, we have to look at that and our role in not taking action against it. This quote, though, has really inspired me from Heather McGee's amazing new book, The Sum of Us. She writes this: "I'm fundamentally a hopeful person because I know decisions made the world as it is, and better decisions can change it. Nothing about our situation is inevitable or immutable, but you can't solve a problem with the consciousness that created it." Which is why I think it is so important that as we work on addressing these policies and these things, we continue to think about it not just as an individual issue or individual problem, but also as a systemic problem, and try to find those systemic solutions that can help solve it. One of those areas, to me, is how we look at land, who controls land. And for us at City Roots Community Land Trust, we believe in permanently affordable, community-controlled land. We're just focused on the city, but believe that this could be a very effective tool for creating affordable housing in the suburbs by creating suburban community land trusts. So here's how it works. The community owns the land and the members vote on their boards. They get to decide how that land is used. And it's kind of taken from that private real estate market. We put a tool into our deeds, almost like a racial covenant, that has to do with how much the home can be sold at, as a way to keep it permanently affordable for the next 99 years. Built into our board structure, which is very different from many other boards of nonprofits or housing organizations, is 1/3 of the board has to be people that live in a land trust property or own a land trust home. And that's true of our board. 1/3 of the board have to be people in the immediate community, and only 1/3 of the board can be stakeholders and experts, bankers, real estate agents, those kinds of folks. So the board is 2/3 dominated by folks that have to be elected immediately by people who live in those land trust homes. We're democratically governed, membership based. We steward the land, we ensure that permanent affordability and community control. You can see some of our work. I think we're up to about 16 properties now. We mostly purchase zombie properties from the land bank or take over slumlord properties with our work with the tenant union. And you can see some really exceptional work that's been done by our volunteers and team who have done some really amazing stuff. We were formed out of Liz McGriff's story, where Liz was being foreclosed on after the 2008 housing crisis. She refused to leave when the sheriff came to evict her. She called up a bunch of friends, including myself, who linked arms outside of her house, saying, "You cannot kick Liz out of her home. We will not have our neighbor leave." And over the years, we successfully won and put her home in the land trust, and Liz serves on our board. We also fight against eviction and work to change policy around home ownership and eviction. We had over 8,000 evictions just 2 years ago in this community, and those kinds of things have got to change. So before I open it up for question and answer, one, I just want to invite you all to take a deep breath. I know I just shared a lot of information. It was overwhelming. And for some of you, this might be some very new information about our community. So just take a deep breath. Now I want you to open up your chat. And I don't want you to hit enter, but I want you to start typing. Just name a feeling that you're having after hearing this information. And then just share something that you learned or something that surprised you or stuck out to you from this presentation. This is called a waterfall. I'll give everybody 1 minute. Just sort of name a feeling in the chat and name something that surprised you, or something that you learned, or something maybe that you're still wondering. And then we'll open it up to some larger discussion, have folks kind of introduce themselves and have some conversation and dig in a little deeper, and maybe even talk about how we move forward with this work. All right, but don't hit enter yet. Jason, you broke the rules. So again, in the chat, don't hit enter. I'll tell you one in a minute. But just type a feeling you're having and something that you learned or surprised you or that you're still wondering. Don't hit enter yet.
Yeah, I did not fulfill the assignment correctly, so don't hit enter. Just type it in as Shane described there. So sorry about that, Shane.
Forgiven, but not forgotten. Take about 30 more seconds. Again, a feeling, maybe something that you learned, surprised you, or something you're still wondering in the chat. All right, ready? 3, 2, 1, go ahead and hit enter. Folks saying the degree of redlining is overwhelming. Feeling bad that this happened, not realizing some of the extent. Hopeful that we're heading in a better direction. Thinking of how recent these examples are. Feelings of disheartened, surprised about the Ku Klux Klan being in this community. Sadness about these policies. Grateful to learn about the history. Surprised by the obvious structural nature of the racism. That humans could be capable of this kind of hate. Agree that the planning profession participated in this. Anger, especially around George Eastman and the eugenics movement. And those minstrel shows, and hopefully that we can move towards a place of more change. So thanks for taking that second to sort of process. I'd love to invite folks, if you're free or able to or willing, to turn on your screen so we can have more of a conversation. And I don't know, I just want to, before we have a conversation, just invite folks to kind of adhere by a couple of norms for the discussion. Just the first, let's be curious. 2, let's just be respectful. And 3, accept your intent, but also own the impact of your words. And let's have a really good conversation. So if folks are able to turn on their screen, that's great. If not, no worries. Feel free to put a question in the chat, but even better, please just unmute and offer up questions, comments, or ideas for how we move forward with this work, especially as land people and planner type folks. What's your role in owning your history in this and how we move forward? So who's got a question or comment or thought? I see Christine in the chat asking, what are some ways to encourage more inclusive communities within small rural towns? I don't know. That's interesting. It's like,
let me, yeah, I had a few thoughts on that. And in fact, our other speaker could not be with us today, but Wes Kennison from Geneseo was going to speak on some of the, while not technically urban renewal, it was some of the land use change that was occurring in Geneseo in the 1960s and 70s as the SUNY campus grew, and sort of which neighborhoods were designated as worthy of protection and which neighborhoods were designated as worthy of destruction. And it fell very much along class and ethnic lines. You know, I grew up in a rural town in Western New York, and there was essentially one family of color in the town. And as a kid, you know, it was something of a curiosity for me, and you know, sort of it was news if we saw them at Tops, like, oh mom, I saw the black family today at Tops. Like it's sort of a childhood curiosity thing. And so I did not grow up in a very diverse environment, but I think those of us who grew up in smaller communities or more rural communities or who now live in them, I think if you start digging, you will find stories similar to Geneseo in neighborhoods that were, you know, perhaps not on the scale of Rochester, but that saw similar end results. certainly I look at places like Batavia and Newark and Wayne County that took enthusiastic advantage of urban renewal money and demolished half of their main streets. And, while we lament the loss of the historic structures on Main Street, I think, we should also look at what else was demolished in those urban renewal efforts in places like Newark and Batavia, and the streets right behind Main Street, and who lived in those streets at the time. So that's not a great answer, but I think if we start to do some digging in our communities, we will find similar stories.
One thing I want to add about that, Jason, I think everything you're saying is spot on, is the redlining maps are often seen as like, that was the end all be all. It was just a guide. These were up in the real estate offices and banks, but the real estate board, in fact, I've seen the maps at our local real estate board, they kept their own updated maps, demographic maps of every neighborhood across Monroe County. They wanted to make sure they knew, because they knew they couldn't get a federally backed mortgage for their folks to move in if it wasn't a white neighborhood. So they were like, the assessors, the real estate agents, they were collaborating. They didn't need a redlining map to know that. They were often making their own maps, but also the local real estate agents, especially in smaller rural areas, they knew which were the neighborhoods. And often, just like in Rochester, the redlining map didn't make the segregation in the 3rd and 7th ward. The city fathers had already been steering and real estate agents into those two neighborhoods, because that's where the homes were the most dilapidated. And it was just like most cities, they designed those ghettos. And then when the federal government came in, it codified the policies that local real estate agents were already doing and reinforced. So you don't need a redlining map for the FHA to continue to enforce that kind of segregation. Rural areas were pretty much often majority green lined, unless they had migrant camps. And that was often like its own separate little thing too, because those were temporary residents usually, especially in a place like Wayne County. But in places like Wayne County or Hilton, it's really interesting. There's lots of stories of both Black and Latino folks in the 50s, 60s, like Edwin Rivera, who went to like Jimmy's restaurant in Marion and was denied service because he was Puerto Rican. The DNC even wrote an article about how, no well-to-do white establishment in the 50s would serve a Black person, from these migrant camps. Like it was publicized and clear that this was Jim Crow without the signs. Like people knew and it was happening. You just don't always necessarily have the map. But I guarantee there are racial covenants throughout our rural communities. Because if you could show the federal government you had racial covenants on your development, you are much more likely to receive that funding upfront from them to be able to build your development. Like all of the Levitt towns, or like Norman Huck's Brookley Estates and Gates, those were all built with government money came in up front. Then they bought the land and put the racial covenants on it, because these big developers were able to work out those sweetheart deals with the government as long as that class and racial exclusion was tied in. And I think work still needs to be done to go to those county clerk houses. Monroe County's, a lot of students are actively still searching for deeds here, but in Wayne County and those other different counties in the area, we'll need a couple folks who enjoy microfilm and just some slog work of looking at all the deeds from 1920 to about 1950. It's some fun work, and I recommend Allison in the chat asked about finding those, reading the report from Yale, which I shared in the chat there. And also just some of it is you got to figure it out. It's a pain, but it's kind of fun once you get going. Mike mentions that he sees deeds with these restrictions in the verbiage. They're still on the deeds. Yes, these have not been taken off. They're just no longer enforceable. But I'm not a person of color, but I imagine I'd feel pretty uncomfortable if I was buying a home in Brighton or Pittsburgh or Penfield, and I went to buy the house and noticed in that signing ceremony, oh, wow, I couldn't have lived here before 1968. This is really uncomfortable. And then you look at the demographics of your neighborhood and realize you're the only person of color in that neighborhood. And things have changed, but at the same time, I definitely know people of color who have chosen not to end up going through with their sales after they realized what was on those neighborhoods. And a lot of those neighborhoods, it's public. I mean, I've been on Evan Dawson, it's been in the paper, Justin Murphy did articles, Yale's talked about it, right? Neighborhoods like Brighton and Meadowbrook, they've publicly owned this, and they've added anti-racist clauses and statements of welcome, and they're working to make reparation. I don't know why Brooklyn's not doing that. I don't know why Rogers Estates, almost all Somerville, all of Northwest Irondequoit pretty much, Ellison Park area, all of these neighborhoods in every single town that has them. If I was a white person who had racial covenants in my home and it's been publicly called out, I would want to, one, make my neighborhood more welcoming by starting with the deeds and some public admission that this is part of it and we've got to do something about it. So I like some of that stuff.
Shane, I was wondering, you know, it seems historically a lot of this dates from the 19 teens and 20s, and that's when we see sort of a resurgence of racism in the country with the birth of a nation and the rise of the KKK and some of the, you know, we're learning some of the memorials to the Confederacy are not actually from the immediate post-war period, but they're from the early 20th century. Do these restrictive covenants go along with that history, or, you know, have you seen earlier ones from the 19th century, or were they just not documented in the same way?
We found some in Webster. I mean, they're in cursive. It's rough, and some in Pittsburgh also in like cursive. It's awful to read cursive on microfilm. But from 1880s and 90s, where people were putting these covenants in. But I mean, the real estate market wasn't really. It was kind of house by house at the time back then, right? It hadn't quite been industrialized in the way it is today. So I think that's kind of interesting to think about. But it's there. But really, the 20s is when we see the uptick. And that's when, again, Kodak kicks it into gear and starts doing it, and they set the scene. And then Grafton Johnson was one of the biggest real estate tycoons in Rochester and Indiana. He had homes in both places. He had a bunch of pet lions. The DNC did a whole front page article about Grafton Johnson, the real estate mogul and his pet lions. And he put literally upwards of 3,000 racial covenants we've found so far on the land that he purchased and developed with Alliance Realty and General Realty. People like Fred Tosh partnered with him. A number of like big famous local builders who built homes all across the community signed right on to those racial covenants. So that's an interesting piece of it. It's definitely tied to birth of a nation. I think that's part of it. It's definitely tied to having someone like a Woodrow Wilson in the White House during those periods of time, showing those kinds of things, that segregation in the federal government. It's definitely tied there, but it's also in 1924 that Frederick Babcock publishes Race-Based Mortgage Assessment. He's in Chicago. He's like the guy on systematizing how to use race to determine if a mortgage is safe in a neighborhood. He writes the book on it. Franklin Roosevelt hires him to run the FHA and write the underwriting manual that creates the redlining maps. Chicago was like the place. And the reason is because in the 10s and 20s, what's happening? The Great Migration. If you haven't read The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, you have missed out on a beautiful, amazing text documenting the Great Migration, especially to Chicago, where thousands of Black folks are fleeing domestic terrorism in the South, and Chicago was one of their first stops. In the 20s in Rochester, though, you've got less than 5,000 Black people who live here. So it's fascinating that George Eastman was actually worried that a Black person would ever buy one of his houses in Meadowbrook or ESL Bank. What were the chances when there's less than 5,000 people of color living here? I mean, less than 1% or more of the population. It's kind of crazy to think about it. And yet they're following what was happening. The DNC is running articles about how it's just a prudent thing to do. You know, heads of churches here in Rochester, the Universalist Church, a bunch of the Methodists and Presbyterians, they were hosting like national eugenics speakers to come speak to their congregations on Sunday about the super race. In fact, at the Rochester Hotel, Ira Powers and the Super Race Foundation had their annual meeting, and even a Super Race Foundation Sunday school class for students, a whole curriculum that you could adopt at your church. I mean, it was there, and yet people could not have been super upset about the people of color who were living here at the time because it was such a small population. So it's really, really interesting, some of that stuff. Let's see here. Oh, earlier there was a great comment from Christine who's in Brighton. I don't want to put you on the spot, Christine, but I'd love to hear more about what's going on in Brighton with zoning and some of your work on that if you want to share. But if not, too early days, absolutely no worries. You there, Christine? I can't hear. Can you guys? Oh, I can't.
Looks like she is unmuted briefly. I don't know if she's.
Oh, okay. Well, while she figures that out, or if she's open, that's fine. No worries if not. But there is some really interesting stuff around zoning that I think as planners would be really important to be thinking about. If you haven't read Connor Dwyer Reynolds' piece on, this was his dissertation for Yale Law School. He wrote it on Penfield, where he grew up. And he went through the records and actually uncovered in the minutes all these petitions as race as a motivation for exclusionary zoning. It's fascinating to read, and it's gone even deeper, and you'll see this in our curriculum. The other thing that's really interesting to think about, oh no, sorry, Christine, bummer, is Desegregate Connecticut. I know Sarah Bonin came into town, who helped run that out of Hartford. They're doing some really amazing stuff. They've been talking a lot about ADUs and how simple it would be to have some accessory dwelling units be allowed to be put on in suburban towns would change who could live in some of these places. To as simple as just towns moving away from that like spot-based PUD type zoning process where everything has to be voted on, and instead planning our towns, using our comprehensive towns from a place of inclusion and of equity. I know Matthew Brown in Fairport has pushed for some of this. Kevin Beckford, I'm sure you've seen some of his story in Pittsburgh and the pushback. I don't know, there's a bigger conversation. And I think what's really missing oftentimes, public officials don't know how to translate the really complicated minutia of something like zoning or a comprehensive plan that is truly equitable. And folks like you in this space, I think you have a lot of the potential to talk about that and offer your time and services, or even volunteer some of that space to help our town board officials, including your own town boards, think through this and really have the information that they need to build the kind of comprehensive plan that is going to bring integration and inclusion and be something that isn't going to cause people to freak out. I don't know. I think that's a really important piece of it. I'd love to hear what you guys all think about some of that. And Christine, I'm excited for updates next time I see you.
My name's Vincent. Thank you, Shane. That was a really great presentation, just really well presented information and important. Yeah, so thank you. That was awesome. I'm in the town of Italy, which is in the county of Yates.
Okay.
So we're south about an hour or so from Rochester, and I'm on the planning board there, obviously. And I don't know, there's your last point. I mean, I think our population is 98% white or something. And so, I don't know, your last point was how do we make our communities more inclusive? And I think about that a lot. And I don't, I can imagine going from say like, well, anyway, I don't know. I just want to hear what you think about the 2% or less than 2% and how to make a community feel more welcoming with the sort of political signs we have all over the place around elections and that sort of thing. But I was also wondering if I went to the county courthouse to look up deeds, it would be in Penn Yan. What would I be looking for within the town of Italy, do you think? Or what might I find? I kind of imagine some of those covenants, if they existed in Penn Yan, would be in neighborhoods in Penn Yan, especially in like affluent sections of the town or something like that. And I'm curious if they look different in a rural area like Italy that's very agricultural or has that kind of different history. So I think those are my two questions and where I'm coming from. I'm looking for takeaways for, I guess, specific to my my town and what I'm working on. Thanks.
Yeah, good question, Vincent. Thank you. For being more inclusive, I don't have that figured out. I'm not sure what would inspire someone to move to a town that's 2% Black if they were a person of color. Aside from trying to be more welcoming, hiring consultants to design the community in a way that looks more inviting, that people of color are represented in signage and in places and in libraries and in schools, that schools have curriculum like ours that own this history, that the town has publicly made it clear that they have participated in some of these policies, benefited from them, that they've, some of these towns are sundown towns, and thinking about some of that and owning it, and also raising up the examples of folks of color that have moved to that town. And really probably even the best place would be paying folks in those towns who represent marginalized groups to, off the record, come in and talk with town planners and leaders about what it's like to be in this town, what's kept them there, why they moved there, and what they think would help. And then from there, starting to build a plan based on those folks and asking them, what can we do to make you feel more welcome? And really just listening and being ready to have done some of the hard work that needs to be done before even those kinds of conversations can happen, where we've examined our own bias, our own privilege, the ways we've benefited from these things, so that we're not defensive in one of those spaces when someone gives us some feedback that's a little hard to hear. I think that's a good start. I think there's a lot more that can be done, and places that are doing a good job and trying to figure out how to learn from those places. The other thing then with the covenants, in going to like the courthouse or the county clerk's office in Penn Yan, I don't know how well the records are kept there. Monroe counties are okay, but it can be a bit of a challenge. So first I'd get the lay of the land, ask your county clerk to show you around, or ask the county clerk to have their employee in charge of finding deeds show you around. The other thing I'd recommend is asking for help from one of the deed assessors. We have partnered with a bunch of the title agencies who spend a ton of time. Those folks are experts at going back through the microfilm and deeds. And if you could find someone who's willing to offer you some time to show you how to look things up in there, it'll make the process go a lot easier. I had a real estate attorney who does a lot of this work, Jim Pergolese, who works for the land trust, helped me out in the beginning. The county clerk helped me out a little bit. But you got to start there. The other thing I recommend is taking advantage of the New York Historic Newspapers website and newspapers.com. I just searched for housing in especially the 20s and 30s and 40s, and looked for any big developments. And I just coded in the words like undesirable, restriction, rigid restriction, and found that to be really helpful. Or rigid restriction tract was one of the big code words. And then from there, we were able to pull out a bunch of like little tracts that were being built, or a pocket of 4 houses. And then from there, you need to know the last name of the developer or the last name of a person. Often papers would publish photos of people when they buy a house in the 30s and 40s, and like, here are Mr. and Mrs. Smith in Galena Drive in Brighton, 1938. And I'd go Smith, 1938, Brighton. And you have to go through the plat book, you go and you find it, and then you go find the right microfilm, and then you search your way through. It's a bit of a hassle, but once you get in the zone of it and figure it out, it gets pretty fun. And then you find your first covenant and you're like, oh man, this is something else. And then usually if you can find a roll of tape that's got a covenant on it, you just kind of go and read all 300 covenants on that tape and end up finding 10 or 20 more. And then the gold mine is when you find one that's like one covenant that is for an entire tract all at once. That's where I think they'll have less luck in a more rural area like Italy, where homes might have been more one by one versus big tracts. I don't know. That'd be an interesting place to start though, using the papers, even your town historian to tell you, what were some of the big developments that were being built. I think older folks do kind of know too about some of this stuff. So it's interesting to ask them. Hope that helps, Vincent.
Yeah, thank you.
Vincent, I put a few notes in the chat room there. I think, in my experience with rural towns, unlike say a Brighton or a suburban town, it's harder to address the issues of equity through zoning, because zoning is so minimal to begin with in rural towns, and you're not, the whole town essentially is zoned rural, single family residential. So it's not like you're segregating, you know, there's just the context is not, you know, the place where multifamily would likely ever be, kind of thing, as opposed to a denser inner ring suburb that has, you know, transit and water and sewer and all that kind of infrastructure. So I guess, you know, my thought is to try and I know this takes a long time, but just to try and shift the conversation and shift the culture a little bit. And if you do happen to have any historical figures that were people of color, to highlight those, to you know, maybe give current folks the idea that, hey, that, you know, this place has always had a few, you know, has always had people of color in it, and they've contributed to the community. So maybe it is a welcoming place. And you know, the danger is, you know, you don't want to just be performative in doing that. But I found in the rural town I worked for in Tompkins County, you know, having discovered that there were African-American Revolutionary War veterans that settled in the town, that was a good thing to highlight in the local history, as opposed to the Confederate general that had spent time in the town. So so it's a little thing, but I think it's a place to start, along with what, you know, Shane went through with starting to research the deeds in the county records.
Yeah. Christine, I think I see a hand up there.
Yes, I have a question. It's kind of piggybacking off of Vincent's questions that he had. Would you recommend that a zoning and a planning department within in cooperation with their town board create a proclamation for inclusivity to welcome the growth in minorities within communities? And like Vincent, my own community is 98% or close to predominantly Caucasians. I am Caucasian. My children are African American, and I can honestly tell you that in my almost 45 years within my own community, not much has changed. And I want my own kids to be able to feel that they're welcomed as they grow, and their families will be, you know, their children someday, my grandchildren will be welcomed, and that community can grow to more than what it is today. I mean, is there a benefit to a town creating that proclamation?
I don't think it hurts. I think something like that can be really important, as long as there's policy that's actually changing. Is there going to be some space for affordable housing to be built? You know, scattered multi-site kind of potential things that could be an effective way to help people come into the town. Towns like, when I think of like a place like Evanston in Illinois, who did some like small scale reparations that in no way make up for what's needed, in my opinion, at the federal level, but really offering first, like home buyer grants, not even for first time, but just for Black and Latino families, saying you couldn't have lived in our neighborhood for a long time until 1968. And if you are someone, a person of color, like, you can apply for a grant to help us, you know, to help pay for your down payment. I think those kinds of things, even if like a pot of money was pulled together in a community. I mean, I'd love to see the Pittsfords and Fairports and Penfields do something like that. We're thinking about making a community land trust so that that can stay an affordable place, but the person can build equity. I think that kind of thing can go a long way, but I think the statement only matters if there's some type of action connected to it that is going to visibly change something, especially in terms of a policy that currently might be pricing people out of that community. I think that's important. I think that's important. And that statement represents that it's not just race, but it's also class diversity, and that those things are important and are going to make a community better for all and richer for all. That feels really important to me.
I think for a lot of rural places, especially in the Finger Lakes, the class race lines are drawn differently than in bigger cities like Rochester, even a Batavia or Geneva, where, you know, there's a lot of rural poverty. You know, the classic divide is between the lake people and the hill people, and so you may actually end up having more racial and ethnic diversity amongst the wealthy enclaves along the lake as opposed to the upland areas, which are probably overwhelmingly white, but may have a lot more poverty. So I think, you all know your communities best. So I think, the issues may present themselves a little bit differently depending on where you are. But I agree with Shane that, a symbolic gesture like a proclamation, should not happen alone, that it should be followed up with some kind of action as well. And this is a relatively new area for a lot of us. Again, I grew up fairly sheltered in one of those 98% white towns, and I went into a profession that I thought, going into it, planning is colorblind. And my specialization is actually urban design, so it's about the physical design of places, and that's agnostic. It doesn't matter what color the people are. It's does the space feel safe and pleasant to be in? And I've learned that that my profession has a lot to answer for, and that it's not as simple and as I went into this thinking. So I think that's another thing you can do is examine your own endeavors, whatever you do for work, in your community, for things like that. And I think conversations like this start this process. There's one more quick thing I'll add before, if there's any more questions. In the fall local government workshop, the spring one, we had a session on Indigenous people and acknowledging their presence in communities. And I really like the example of Fairport, which took down, they examined their historical markers in the community and took down a historical marker that celebrated the birth of the first white child in the community. And I think in a lot of rural places, that may be a place to examine for equity as well. And how are Indigenous people acknowledged in your local histories, and things like that. So I'm happy to stay as long as
those signs, Jason, and putting them in a museum, putting them in context, making sure that sign is taught in your schools, that matters. Like what did this mean for our town, and how did it stay up until 2021? I'm not in favor of just taking down a monument and never talking about it again. I think contextualizing those things is really important, or those signs, and owning it. And then back to Christine's comment about the proclamation of welcome. To me, it can't be a proclamation of welcome without owning that the town has not always welcomed. And we know that there were racist policies and that people in our town helped enforce them. And we have not always been a welcoming place, and we want to be better. And even thinking about some of that, and inviting the people of color in your town to have input on what that statement looks like and is, I think is also going to be really important. Finally, I shared a recording of my presentation in the chat, and at the end goes a little bit deeper into U of R's history, particularly with George Eastman, if you're interested in that. And the last thing I'd say is, if you live in Monroe County, I really encourage you to reach out to your town school boards and invite them to, and just ask, are you teaching this history? Have you partnered with the Monroe Inquiry Project or the Anti-Racist Curriculum Project at the Pastone Foundation? I just want you to know, I think it's really important that our kids learn this. You guys have all seen in the news how some people have not been very favorable at school board meetings about the full history of our community being taught. And I think there is real fear that those voices are a whole lot louder than maybe the folks in a space like this who would like this to be taught, but maybe haven't taken that simple civic action of just going to one school board meeting and speaking, or just sending a simple email to your school board, saying, this is important to me. Is it being taught? And who are you partnering with to make sure that this happens and are people of color involved? And please reach out to me. My email I'll put in the chat if you have any questions about the history or about this curriculum, or just in general about how we move forward. But I just want to say thank you to Jason and for inviting me, and for everyone for having me today. And just grateful for this time to talk with you all. So thanks.
Shane, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today. This is a critically important topic and one that has not been talked about enough in sort of the realms of planning and land use. On behalf of Genesee Finger Lakes Regional Planning Council, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending this afternoon. I'm going to keep the meeting open just in case you want to scroll back through the chat and take down any information. At this point, you're free to go. We will be sending out emails documenting your attendance so that you have that. And again, feel free to reach out to me at any time if you have any questions about this session or local government workshop in general. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.